Thank you so much for coming, Joe, to our Existential Hope group and our Existential Hope podcast. So Joe is a researcher at Open Philanthropy or research analyst. And I think you're focusing mainly on existential risk from AI. And I know you also have a doctorate from University of Oxford in philosophy. And I've basically come across your writing, especially on Utopias. And that's why I thought it would be really fun to have you here in the group, because I read your thoughts on Utopia Actually Possible article. And also I know you've written some stuff on infinite ethics that I'm really curious to hear about. And so, yeah, I thought it was like a perfect fit for coming on this podcast. Welcome. And maybe I'll just start with the first question being like, who are you? What are you working on? Like your life story in 3 minutes.
Sure. So thanks for having me. So I work on existential risk from AI and kind of more broadly on how we should orient towards the long-term future of humanity. And I got into that via philosophy and to some extent kind of interest in kind of big picture questions, and then that sort of connected me with folks who were thinking specifically about the future, and I think AI is an especially kind of pivotal technology with respect to how the future goes. So that's been my focus there. And then I do some philosophical work and writing independently, and then I also work at Open Philanthropy, which is a foundation that cares a lot about this kind of stuff.
Yeah, wonderful. In terms of what you're working on, what does the normal everyday life look like for you as a researcher at Open Phil?
It's a lot of reading and writing and Slack and Google Docs. It's nothing too exotic. I think I think unique aspect of my work at Open Phil in particular is I think that Open Phil is a kind of unique intersection of kind of high level philosophical considerations feeding into fairly object level kind of choices and interventions and grants and stuff like that. And so that's been especially exciting for me as a philosopher. I think many philosophers are kind of hungry for translation of their ideas into some sort of impact. And I think Open Phil is a cool chance to do that.
Yeah. Would you want to maybe also just dive into anything in particular that you're researching now? I guess focusing on AI?
Yes, right now I'm thinking about AI alignment and kind of ways we might what sort of techniques and ideas and kind of plans are available for making sure that that our AI systems are kind of understood and kind of are behaving in ways that are kind of beneficial for humanity. At a somewhat higher level, over the past 6 months or so, I've been working on a kind of cluster of topics that assume we're going to have really transformational AI technology within the next couple decades, but that kind of scan the horizon for important features or important kind of levers, interventions, issues other than technical AI alignment, to make sure a lot of the discourse at Open Philanthropy and to some extent more broadly in kind of various nearby communities with respect to AI focuses on this question of alignment and kind of whether these systems will be kind of suitably under our control. And so I've been looking at questions about just seeing if there's other things that need to be on our radar too. So things about moral patienthood, things about kind of suffering, things about misuse risk. I've been interested in some questions about kind of some sort of especially galaxy brain stuff about infinities and kind of the multiverse and other stuff. So I've been kind of looking somewhat more broadly and seeing if there's other stuff that we need to be thinking about. But then very recently, I've kind of pulled back to alignment.
And so when you look at alignment and it's not technical alignment, is it like policy or what is it?
Well, right now, I'm actually looking at a somewhat more technical level at different proposals for aligning AI systems. But I think, so I think it's probably closer to technical alignment than policy. But I think they merge, and I'm not doing ML experiments. It's at a higher level than that.
Yeah. I've been really curious to dive into your infinite ethics writing. Does that go into what you're doing right now? And can you maybe just explain for someone who doesn't know infinite ethics what it is?
Sure. So infinite ethics is basically ethical theory that tries to grapple with infinities in kind of various respects. In particular, I think thinking about how you choose between actions that have some possibility of kind of impacting an infinite number of people or kind of otherwise having a kind of infinite impact on the world. And then more broadly, you can also think about just like how you would rank different situations that involve infinite numbers of people. And this is, I think, an interesting and important topic at a theoretical level, because basically just most of our ethical theory is developed in a context that just ignores infinities, and that makes things very simple. But it's also, I think, instructive where, insofar as when you bring the infinities in, suddenly a lot of these theories break, and or kind of, and in fact, we can actually go further and show that there are a number of kind of impossibility results that you can get in infinite context, where, kind of a number of very attractive axioms or kind of ethical principles you might have thought were compatible are actually incompatible in the infinite case. And so there's a kind of theoretical challenge, and I think there's also actually just a practical challenge, which is that there's some chance that we live in an infinite universe. There's some chance that we can have infinite impact in our actions, and so I think we actually face these questions in a practical context too.
And do you have an example of one of those things that you think we're taking for granted that it's working as an assumption today, but if we bring in the infinite aspect, it doesn't hold?
Well, so yeah, I think a very simple one. There's a sort of reasoning that people sometimes use in thinking about how much to prioritize the long-term future, which sort of made famous by Nick Bostrom in this piece, Astronomical Waste, where he does a quick kind of back of the envelope calculation as to how many people might exist in the future, and gets this sort of astronomical number and expectation in virtue of kind of the possibility that we go out and kind of settle the stars and turn them into kind of optimal computational substrate and run mines on them and stuff like that. And so you get like 10 to the 50 people could exist in expectation in the future. And so then if there's an event that kind of cancels that future, an existential risk, then the thought is that that's sort of this kind of astronomical catastrophe, and reducing it is sort of in sort of utilitarian terms, reducing the probability of existential risk should be a sort of overwhelming ethical priority. So that argument relies on a combination of a kind of a certain sort of population ethics that values these future people in a certain way, and then it also relies on a certain kind of expected value reasoning, where you're basically kind of, yeah, there's a kind of a standard way of doing expected value reasoning, where you weight the actions by the different worlds and what they do, and how much value is at stake in each of those worlds. But if you try to do that with infinities, it just breaks immediately, or at least so if you have different infinite outcomes with sort of infinite value at stake, you have some probability of doing infinite harm and some probability of doing infinite goodness, or you have some actions that will help an infinite number of people and hurt an infinite number of people at the same time. And if you rearrange it, so basically, I think that's like a very basic early way that infinities start to matter is to, if you're doing EV reasoning, it just gets a lot harder. And actually, we are doing EV reasoning quite a lot, or many arguments are made in those terms, but they just sort of bracket the infinite case.
And if we try to get more concrete in terms of this, or like concrete in terms of thinking about the future, because you wrote this post, like thoughts on Utopia, and that it's like actually possible. So, well, maybe we dive into that a little bit, because first of all, you suggest that there are like two different types of utopias. Yeah, maybe explain those two different versions first.
Sure. So the post distinguishes between what I call concrete utopias and sublime utopias. And concrete utopias are basically just utopias that are described in concrete ways that we can kind of directly imagine and kind of engage with. And so a lot of like fictional utopias and even some of the kind of political philosophy that tries to deal with utopias is often you're talking about a situation with humans, and you're imagining them in maybe kind of somewhat rearranged political structures. Maybe they have more abundance. Maybe there's a certain vibe. Often people are actually secretly trying to describe a dystopia, and it's sort of kind of point out the flaws with something that would have seemed good. And my worry about so I'm kind of more resistant to concrete utopias, basically because I worry that they're going to undersell what's possibly at stake and just how good the future could be. And so there's this example in the post that I get from Nick Bostrom, which says, if you imagine kind of early primates deciding whether to evolve into humans, and they're sort of given this chance to imagine the future that they could have if they sort of evolved into humans, and they ask the question they ask is something like, okay, but will we get a lot of bananas if we become human? And they will. It's not that we actually have quite a lot of bananas now, but it's sort of not the right question to be asking. There's some way in which you're missing what's important, or what's really at stake in kind of this horizon that's in some sense beyond your comprehension. And I'm personally more sympathetic to kind of modes of engagement with utopia that route via what I'm calling the sort of the sublime conception of utopia that tries to find ways to, which is basically kind of conceiving of utopia in a way that foregrounds its kind of otherness and incomprehensibility, but also where that otherness and incomprehensibility is in some sense an extension of the direction that things travel when they become better. And I think that has downsides too. It can kind of be empty of content. It can lose kind of the resonance with our direct emotional experience. But I think it's more accurate, and I think it can be. There are ways of kind of getting a grip on it that bring it to life.
Yeah, I think also your, I guess, boss, Holden Karnowski, has written this thing also on like conservative utopias towards more radical utopias. And I also find that one, because what's interesting, I guess, in terms of this concrete utopia versus the more sublime utopia is, well, what you're saying, like our capacity to imagine like grand futures or like greatness in the future, I guess. But then there's also like the trade-off with the more sublime you go, maybe that's like you lose a few people along the way. And so, yeah, there's this, what he writes about, like with this, the conservative utopia, I think is like the world as it is minus cancer or something like that. And so that's that. Yeah, that's a bit too boring maybe for most of us. But I guess this somewhere in between that I think is more like imagining an episode of Friends or something like that, where like everyone is sort of, they have their material needs met, but the challenges that we face are like in our love life or something like this, but still like fairly similar to this world. Personally, like what is your personal, this is where I would like to go? And then secondly, what do you think is the best in terms of communicating utopia or trying to get more people on board with the ideas or thinking about it or getting excited about it?
Cool. Yeah. So let me. I think they're somewhat different in that, and it also does depend on kind of how people are orienting. I do think at a basic level, there's sort of two steps in my kind of conception of utopia. One, it has to do with a kind of lower bound, which is sort of the extrapolation of the no more cancer thing, where you just think about the true kind of horrors of the world, kind of poverty and disease and death and oppression, and not the sort of, oh, maybe it's ultimately good to have a little bit of it, or people can get sort of like, oh, maybe it's good, but I think of the stuff that's really, it's just like, this should end. And I think there's a basic and I think very deep feature of at the very least we can just end the kind of the horrors of this world. And there are questions at the edges around exactly what that looks like, but I think there's something about just kind of making gentle the life of this world, at least, which you don't need to get into kind of crazy transhumanist anythings to, I think, resonate with. I think that's a kind of lower bound. And then I think we don't know what the upper bound is. And I think people have different appetites for kind of alienness in that respect. I think my own favored way of engaging with it, and also both in terms of presenting it to others and to myself, is using a method that I call kind of extrapolating the direction of our best experiences or best kind of collective or individual experiences. You imagine there are these, it's a notable feature of just our everyday human lives for many of us that the best moments, whether by ourselves or with others, or there are times that are just kind of remarkably better than the kind of the average or the mundane. And whether that's some kind of experience of love or music, or people who do drugs or meditation, or there's different sort of peak experiences of different kinds where you have this and it's really a kind of, whoa, this is different. This is a kind of degree of aliveness and reality that is kind of a qualitative shift from some sort of baseline. And I think so. I think we know that is possible. We just see that at the very least, life can be as good as the best it has ever been for anyone, and that's really good. And it's actually it's easy to kind of forget how good things can be. It's just generally there's something that's hard about remembering kind of really intense experiences, maybe especially really good experiences when you're not having them. You remember it was really amazing, but you're kind of you're kind of small and caught up in some kind of more mundane fog, and it can be hard to stay in connection with that. But when you're there, you're like, wow. So at the very least, we can get that. I think that's like another step above a kind of lower bound. And then I think what we should do is see the direction that our minds or our lives or our communities moved when they became that kind of qualitative level of better, and then look that direction and then sort of extrapolate. Okay, suppose you could go much further in that direction. What would that be? And I think we basically also know that that's possible too, especially with respect to kind of individual experience. I think it seems very, very likely to me that our capacity for kind of good experience is in some sense gated or constrained by our brains and our kind of specific contingencies of our current biology, and so the kind of space of minds that we currently occupy is really tiny. And I think it just seems, if you really imagine being able to explore the whole space of ways of being and ways of arranging our minds and our communities and our relationships and all sorts of stuff, to me it seems very likely that there's just a kind of an expansion of scale, and that is kind of really quite radical. And it's not just a sort of pretty version of our current world. It's really something profoundly different, but still, I think, recognizable as an extension of what's good now.
Yeah, I like that idea of having it somewhat recognizable. I think that, yeah, I guess I've spent some time in the Foresight community now, and I think we have a lot of transhumanist and posthumanist members. So a lot of the futures that are being discussed there are like mind uploading or these types of things I'm starting to feel like kind of familiar with, and it's starting to feel less alien. But it does seem, when communicating on a broader scale, it's been my experience that you need to like have the humans in the future, I guess. But I'd be curious to hear about if you think it's important to think about these things, or like what function it fills to think about the future or to think about utopia.
I think it is important, and I think that partly because, well, just at a basic level, and this is one of the things I say in that essay, is just that I think it's just true. I think it's just true that the future could be this good. And so I think our prior should be, if there's a fact, it's good to kind of recognize that fact, and especially if it seems kind of like it might be relevant to our conception of our situation and our goals. I don't think there's like a big burden of proof on kind of recognizing this. Now, I do think there's a kind of history of failure modes with respect to kind of human engagement with the notion of utopia, and I think that's important to have in mind. But just don't think about it, I think, is a kind of strange conclusion. I think for me, on top of that, there's just a basic way in which it's a source of hope. I mean, this series, Existential Hope, I think is actually it's important to our sense of the stakes of what we do. And there's a way, I think, sometimes our culture can discourage people from inhabiting and taking seriously their sort of deepest aspirations and dreams, and the sort of like best. There's a way in which sort of cynicism and kind of various curtailings of your like aspirations for life and your kind of devotion to life. I think people can get, there's something that's kind of cool or maybe safe about being more like jaded or more kind of despairing or more pessimistic or something like that. And I think we can talk about that, but one thing I think is just wrong. I think people empirically, it's just the case that in fact things might well be extraordinary in the future. Now, I'm not sure. We have to do our part in that respect. But I also think kind of knowing that, it gives you a sense of what is the actual story that we're a part of here. What are the stakes? When it's sort of a different narrative arc or possible narrative arc in your sense of kind of the culmination of the human story and kind of what human pain and joy and kind of striving will have ultimately been a part of if we get things right. So for me, it's just a kind of important structural feature of how I orient towards my own choices and towards my sense of kind of what's going on.
Yeah, I appreciate that, obviously, working with this project. So I think then I'm gonna try to back up a bit and ask you what, if you would describe yourself as optimistic about the future, and if so, like what made you, and if not, why not?
I think I'm probably optimistic relative to a sort of baseline. There's a sort of way of engaging with the future that sort of maybe hasn't done very much in the way of kind of imagining grand, very long-term futures, and instead thinks about the future centrally through questions about, what's going to happen with climate change? Or does it seem like our political system is on a good trajectory or a bad trajectory? Sort of a few centuries out, and kind of centrally with reference to current political conditions or kind of current issues. And I think that it's easy it seems both on the left and on the right. I'm not sure there's a kind of hopeful party or hopeful kind of political sense. Everyone maybe gets more oomph out of pessimism. And So I think I'm probably optimistic relative to that baseline. I think there's a different baseline that I am kind of more pessimistic relative to, which is there's a sort of worldview made famous by kind of Steven Pinker, and I think kind of represented by to some extent maybe there's a kind of pro-growth. I think transhumanists have some of this vibe, or have in the past, where in some sense the kind of the forces in the world, we've seen sort of massive improvements in the world along tons of dimensions: poverty, kind of literacy, democracy, over the past century and a half or something like that. And I think there's a narrative that I feel drawn to in ways that sort of, if we just kind of keep going with that, then we're just on a kind of a great trajectory. And I think I am more, relative to people with that specific view, which I kind of wish I could hold, I have more concern about sort of ways of kind of irreversibly messing up. And my work on AI is a big part of that. And then I think there are, unfortunately, a variety of other ways in which we could kind of drastically curtail the value at stake in the future. I take that pretty seriously. I don't spend a lot of time. And in that respect, I'm more optimistic than, say, Eliezer Yudkowsky, who thinks we're sort of definitely doomed and stuff like that. But it's still, in some sense, I'm spending most of my time paying attention to the worst case scenarios, and in that sense, don't look like an optimist.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that as well. But existential risk seems obvious that we should pay attention to. The term existential hope we took from a paper by Toby Ord and Owen Cotton Barrett, where it was called existential risk and existential hope, and they were trying to define both of the concepts. And so, yeah, how do you relate to both of the concepts? Obviously, like in your everyday life, most of the actions you take seem to be focused on existential risk or like preventing existential risk. But yeah, I suppose it's somewhat driven by existential hope angle or something.
Yeah, I think it is driven by existential hope. I mean, in some sense, the way many people, and I actually think this is a sort of problematic or insufficiently questioned aspect of the discourse around existential risk, because there's an assumption that there's kind of the future you get if you don't fall prey to an existential risk, where the assumption is that future is kind of massively good in expectation. And so in some sense, you get the Steven Pinker narrative unless you fall off the train. You're sort of on this upward trajectory, but the existential risk community adds the concern that you're going to kind of fall off. But if you don't fall off, then it's all up and up, to the stars and the kind of blissful light. I think so. That narrative, I think, is actually quite a hopeful one. And in some sense, you'll see that. So there are communities of people who are much more pessimistic about what the default future looks like, and think it might be, in the limit, it could be kind of net negative and actively bad to make it to the future or something like that. And those people will be correspondingly less worried about existential risk and more interested in things like improving the future conditional on it being very long, or sort of making sure there isn't a lot of suffering in the future or something like that, which is a somewhat different orientation. I'm more in the mode of, so I'm actually less, I think there's a lot of bad futures even without sort of existential risk. I think we could have things that aren't kind of an irreversible lock-in event, something that's not a sort of discrete thing. We could have just like mediocrity. We could just like mess up along tons of dimensions. So I think there's a form of hope that I don't have, which is just, as long as we don't mess up totally irrevocably, then everything will be good. I think there might actually be more effort to be made with respect to kind of attending to worlds where we don't have a kind of traditional existential risk, but nevertheless need to improve it. But ultimately, yes, I think making it to these sort of like really hopeful scenarios is a lot of what drives me.
In general, what would you say makes you excited about the long-term future?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of what I said about kind of ending the horrors and kind of going the distance in terms of how good things can be. I think, there's maybe another dimension of that for me personally, though it's less clear how this scales, is I think I care a lot about some sort of comprehension or kind of truth knowledge related value, where I think right now, in addition to kind of being small in our capacity for kind of welfare and joy, I think we're also just sort of radically under comprehending of our situation. We kind of aren't able to look the universe in the eye. There's a huge amount that we don't know. We're sort of just the kind of earliest stage of becoming aware of what's really going on. And I think there's a part of me that just cares about kind of seeing truly, or having our civilization at some point kind of understand understand its situation fully. That's I think an animating value for me. Less clear how it plays into kind of how you value the scenarios overall.
Yeah, we usually in this podcast ask for a specific positive vision of the future if you have one. Well, yeah, could you share a vision of existential hope for the future? And yeah, the way that we also do it in this podcast is that like we try to take that catastrophe from the paper by Toby and Owen. So basically the opposite of a catastrophe. So an event where there is much more value after it has happened. And we try to use nowadays we use like AI art generators to create an art piece based on this prompt. Yeah, if you could please share a positive vision of the future or a catastrophe.
Yeah, so I don't have a especially concrete one. As I say, I tend to prefer the sort of sublime mode of conceiving of the future. One thing that comes to mind for me there's a line in Corinthians about something like, now we see as in a mirror dimly, then we will see face to face, and now we know in part, then we will know in full. And so I think I guess maybe that's sort of an important image for me, is sort of meeting each other and the universe in some sense face to face, or seeing less dimly than we do now.
Basically seeing clearly. Yeah, I like that. I find whenever I speak to, I don't know, both scientists and philosophers, like a lot of it is about like seeing reality or learning more about reality seems to be like the endless pursuit somehow. Well, there's also like this, the term catastrophe, actually, we yeah, it's a terrible word. And we've tried to find better yeah, versions of it. So if you have any proposals for what we should call it instead, we're very happy to take them. Yeah, do you? It's also okay if you don't.
I wonder about something like existential victory, something like that. I mean, it seems like the big disadvantage of catastrophe is that it's got the word catastrophe in it, and so it's just very hard for that to be good. Anyway, so I wonder about kind of essentially replacing that one.
Yeah, I like that also. One of the more common suggestions is like anastrophe, but then we're again with the strophe. So yeah, I think something like existential victory sounds good. Well, so I think then in terms of, I mean, your vision was very broader. Like it was hard to define, but in terms of trying to think of what you think would be like us moving in the right direction, obviously AI risk is a big one for you. Are there any like other undervalued risks or challenges that you think we need to get around to solving for making sure we're on the right trajectory?
Yeah, so I think we need to be doing a lot more to prepare for kind of treating digital minds well, and thinking about I think there's a lot of new questions that are going to arise if we get to a point where we can kind of create agents and kind of forms of artificial intelligence that in some sense we control, or we have sufficient understanding of, that we can kind of direct them for our ends. There's still a question of, well, what is the sort of moral status of different sorts of minds you're creating in that respect? What is the right set of kind of rights and protections to give to those minds? And then there's a sort of cluster of related issues, I think, that actually have more to do with how do our social and political and legal systems adapt in the face of new practical features of the sort of population once we're talking about digital minds. So I think a very concrete example in a paper from Bostrom and Schulman that I like is there. So we have this sort of deep principle in democracies of one person, one vote. But there's a question of, okay, once you can kind of you can make more citizens very easily. If you have like more GPUs, say, and I can make a bunch of copies of myself, or if they don't count as distinct people, well, maybe I tweak them a little bit, and then they vote, and then maybe they get deleted or collapse back, or who knows. So I think there's like really tough questions about how do we start to govern and kind of allocate influence, and kind of once a lot of the kind of people or minds or kind of stakeholders are digital. And I think related questions: how do we make sure at a certain point, if you're a sadist or a kind of person without a conscience, or who knows, you will be able to kind of create kind of horrible. You'll be able to create kind of suffering if you have a computer. And that's just how are we going to govern that? And we currently, you can't just like grab. I mean, we have these questions about animals, but it's not possible to just grab a human and kind of do what you like with them. But there's a way in which kind of digital minds are kind of at the whim of the kind of people that control their hardware in a way that I think we aren't ready for. So there's a bunch of questions there that I think partly don't get as much attention in virtue of this narrative that I tried to push back on a little bit of, well, if we don't have the existential risk, then everything will be good and we'll figure everything out. And I think a lot of what I'm worried about is, well, maybe we don't all die or we don't have a sort of AI takeover, but we nevertheless kind of fail to take seriously enough the kind of rights and moral status and kind of stakes of what's happening with digital minds more broadly. And obviously there's like a long history of kind of oppression of different minds, especially kind of non-human or kind of outgroup type of mind. So that's like a big one for me that I'd flag, and there's various others.
Yeah, no, that's a super interesting one that I haven't really heard a lot about before. But yeah, and it's very interesting also in the relation to like how we treat animals and these things. But do you have any recommended reading? Is it that paper by Boström and Schulman if one wants to look into this?
I think that would be the place I would start. Yeah, it's a paper called Propositions Concerning Digital Minds and Society. There's also another good paper by them that's kind of more philosophical called, I think it's called Sharing the World with Digital Minds, which gets into kind of questions about ways in which for kind of any conception of moral patienthood, you can actually pretty easily start to see digital minds as capable of what they call like super patienthood, which is their kind of more neutral term for what's in other contexts called a utility monster, or something that in virtue of its capacity for preference satisfaction or welfare or whatever it is that you care about kind of outweighs a bunch of other things, and in particular in this context humans. And so there's some tough questions there too. I would start with the Propositions Concerning Digital Minds paper. I think that's just really great work.
Yeah, thank you. And in terms of your work on AI alignment, there's so much happening there right now? Is there, I don't know what your timeline is, but like within the next 5 years, is there anything in particular, any like breakthrough or thing you would want to see us have in place in the next 5 years to make sure that, or like to make you feel a little bit like we're on the right track?
Well, I think things that would make me feel substantially more optimistic over the next 5 years, if I get to just ask for them, I think if we just understood what was going on in neural networks much better than we do, and in particular if we were at a point of being able to kind of re-engineer or kind of create using kind of more traditional programming methods or kind of human readable code systems that were as capable as GPT-4, or kind of reverse engineer what's going on in GPT-4, just sort of radical progress in interpretability, I think is relatively easy to imagine, though. Or sorry, it's easy to imagine like how we know that had happened. I think it's quite difficult to actually do it, and we're just sort of very far away. But I think a fairly deep intuition for why we are not ready for AI and why AI alignment is a serious problem is just that we don't know how these systems work. We're kind of working with black boxes, and that just doesn't look like a recipe for kind of handling the kind of hottest fire we've ever tried to handle. So I think that's something I would love to see. Yeah, I think somewhat more realistically, I think there are like good forms of coordination and regulation and evaluation and kind of auditing regimes that the world could kind of converge on in the next 5 years. I think that's like more realistic. I think there's still a question of how much that gets you, and obviously there are questions about the right way to do that. But I think very broadly, we want to be getting to a point where we have kind of quantitative consensus tests such that if your AI is capable of replicating itself, if connected to the internet is capable of like escaping and replicating itself and spreading. We know that before you deploy, and we don't deploy it or something like that. And if your AI will kind of help people build bioweapons much better than Google or something like that, well, we know that. And just like a bunch of kind of concrete things that kind of gate the deployment of systems, and that we have kind of effective coordination across the relevant actors, such that there aren't just people can't just surge ahead unilaterally. I think would also help with my optimism, though there's still a lot to do even if we get that.
Yeah, I thank you for sharing that. I think that in terms of you working on AI alignment and these things, is there, if we imagine someone young, new to this field, would you be able to just provide a bit of a like overview of this field that you're operating in, and suggest if they're like what are the possibilities and the challenges?
Sure. I guess at a high level, there's kind of, with respect to AI alignment, especially the form I'm concerned about, is kind of making sure that we, by the time we're deploying kind of very advanced AI systems, we are able to kind of aim them and control them in ways that result in kind of alignment with our intentions. The very broadly, you can break that down into kind of governance related work, which is about kind of setting up the kind of social and political and kind of coordination environment to kind of implement whatever technical solutions are required to kind of cause the AI systems we deploy to have the relevant kind of safety and alignment properties. And then there's the kind of technical work of figuring out what those techniques are. Within the technical side, I think the biggest breakdown in my head is sort of work that is focused on, there's sort of interpretability, which is focused on kind of understanding the internals of these models and kind of building up a better understanding of how they're doing the tasks that they're doing. I think that work is really great if you can get it, but I think it's, my own read is that it's like very, very far behind and unlikely to or I think we probably should not be banking, especially in shorter timeline scenarios, on kind of interpretability, making a bunch of progress that helps us, for example, like check if our models are lying to us and stuff like that. So I'm more personally interested in work on what's called scalable oversight, which is effectively, so right now the way you train a model and make sure that it's the kind of default way you make sure it's kind of behaving in accordance with your intentions is this process called reinforcement learning from human feedback, or RLHF, where basically, you have the model, you have humans, roughly speaking, observing what it's doing and kind of rating it, and whether it's behaving well, and then you kind of update the model so it's more likely to behave in ways that are given high ratings. The issue is that works when humans can evaluate how good the behavior is, or it seems like it's sort of more effective in that regime. But if we start to move into a regime where the models are doing kind of incredibly complicated things that humans can't evaluate because they're smarter than humans, so the model gives you this like giant code base, and it's like, here's all this code, run it, or it starts doing a bunch of physics a human can't understand, or all sorts of things. It's a question of how do you scale our ability to kind of provide oversight for these models, and there's a bunch of work on that. I think that's the area I kind of am most excited about, and would kind of direct a kind of generic, technically talented young person towards maybe first.
Yeah, that seems like very, very important work to to be doing at this time. And so if we go back to, well, actually, no, do you have any reading recommendations or listening recommendations to learn about this?
To learn about AI alignment?
Yeah, good starting material.
Well, let's see. I mean, I have a long report that I wrote about the kind of nature of the problems. That's and there's a number of other people, Ajay Akatra, Richard No, have pieces that kind of try to lay out the basics of like why is this an issue, and then in terms of kind of somewhat more detailed, like what different research avenues. I mean, I recommend if you're interested in interpretability, I would recommend looking at Chris Ola's work. I think if you're interested in scalable oversight, I would recommend maybe starting with Paul Christiano's work and kind of related work on there's debate. There's sort of a variety of different ideas for how to do scalable oversight, and Paul is maybe a good place to start there.
Thank you. So we have like 10 minutes left, and so I want to just go back to the sort of the root, like the existential hope, positive future angle. And so I think the first question that I'll ask then is, it seems really hard for people to think or envision positive futures for the long-term future, especially, I think, whereas like envisioning dystopias is easier. We have that's what we're sort of seeing in most of our fiction, and that we're being sort of fed today culturally. So why do you think that is? And I think, how do you think we can like best change that?
Why is it? I mean, I don't have a great story about why. I think there are various. Yeah, I don't have a great story about why. One thing I'll say is, I think fiction wise, there are some pressures towards having a plot, and plots require like tension, and so it's sort of, if you had a really, really good utopia, I mean, there are these sort of, in some sense, stories about many, I don't know, rich people who have all their needs met are like kind of like utopia, or they're sort of like, you've got like, maybe you still have your emotional problems or your like status anxieties and stuff like that, but maybe we could do better than that in utopia. But so there's, I don't know, that's one pressure, maybe whatever it is that makes people so negative, even in the midst of kind of the world improving in a lot of ways, whatever makes people really feel like the world's on a downward trajectory, even kind of contrary to some of the some of the data could play a role. I'm not sure. And then in terms of changing, I do think just, yeah, getting compelling positive visions that really kind of speak to people's deepest aspirations, especially in a way that I think I don't know. There's something kind of vulnerable about having just like really direct hope for something really amazing. I think sometimes people, the kind of more you hope, the more you're kind of setting yourself up for disappointment or something. Or there's some way in which if you really caring about something is scary. So finding ways to, and then there's also sort of questions people do have these worries about utopic thinking and kind of extremism and ways in which that's gone wrong. And I think understanding that and kind of warding that off. And similarly, people have, I think, rightly to some extent, there are deep connections between this sort of utopian thinking and a sort of animating impulses at work in like religion. And I actually think that's okay. And that's something I talk about in the essay, but I think that's maybe another source of resistance here. And I think should warrants engagement.
And did you have a personal recommendation in terms of something that is more future positive, like a book or a movie or something like that?
I mean, so there's this book, The Precipice by Toby Ord, which is a book I helped with, so I'm kind of biased here, but I think it does the last chapter 8, I think is like a nice statement of kind of the kind of possible stakes of a really good future. And there's also an essay by Nick Bostrom, Letter from Utopia, that I think has some kooky parts, but has been an important component for me.
Yeah, I think those are both great recommendations. We have on the Existential Hope website, we have a lot of like these types of resources listed that people have recommended, and those two are definitely on there, both of them.
Actually, I'll throw in one more that I think is underappreciated. So Will MacAskill's book, What We Owe the Future, there's a little a QR code at the end that links to a story that he wrote that is sort of his vision of a kind of really good future, which I think, so that's another one you could check out.
Yeah, I came across that one afterwards, I think it's called, and that was my favorite one of those that I've read so far. I think because it contained like this where people have the ability to talk to animals, which I always like. Those are my favorite futures always when I come across those. Yeah, is there anything else that in terms of what you've been working and writing on in relation to the future that you think we haven't really gotten into? We've talked about the infinite ethics and these like thoughts on utopia. Is there anything else we should try to touch on as well?
Well, I mean, I think there's a frame that I think has been more salient to me recently, though I'm still trying to understand it well, which is, and this is also something in Nick Bostrom's work, which is in addition to kind of thinking entirely in terms of how do we have a good future for ourselves, I think there's a frame on understanding kind of humanity or Earth's technological trajectory as also a sort of entering into what might be a sort of community throughout the universe of kind of advanced civilizations. And it's sort of unclear what there's different types of kind of exotic forms of interaction these kind of advanced civilizations can have. It's a question of whether our particular, like the kind of causally accessible part of our light cone has any other intelligent life in it. It looks like maybe not. But there are sort of more exotic modes of interaction between civilizations that I've spent like a little bit of time thinking about. I think if you get into that mindset, then there's actually a sort of where you're kind of less alone and you're more like there's a kind of already quite a lot of intelligent civilization somewhere. Then I think there's a somewhat different frame, which is like how do you be a good citizen of the kind of cosmos as a whole, or what are kind of productive and healthy and kind of cooperative and harmonious forms of interaction between kind of everyone, not just kind of people on Earth or AIs, but sort of everyone everywhere. And anyway, it's a kind of exotic domain, but it's one that I think is kind of both interesting and possibly kind of relevant, but also it's just a kind of, I think it's a kind of intuition pump of what is citizenship and what are the norms and kind of virtues that we bring to our interactions with human society. What would that look if we sort of extrapolated to kind of a broader context as well?
Yeah, I think it's super interesting how you're using like your philosophy background and applying it to these, potentially, hopefully, I guess some might say at least real world scenarios. Yeah, how in terms of that's such we may never know if there are others in the universe and these things. But do you think that even though just like thinking about these things, like you said, it sort of helps you think about what does it mean to be a citizen and like being a good citizen and all of these things. Do you think that it's useful to think about these things like so far out anyway, because it helps us see also clearly like where we are today, here, now.
I'm I'm not sure exactly what level of useful that particular frame is. I think part of it is that I think there can be a vibe in some of these contexts where, especially in the context of AI alignment, where the central narrative people use to kind of frame what they're doing is something akin to a kind of competition for power between different value systems. So the fear is that the AIs are sort of, they're going to have different values from us, and there's sort of, the resources are scarce, and the question is sort of which value systems end up with rich resources and stuff like this. And I think the vibe of this can end up kind of voracious and kind of competitive and uncooperative. And so I'm interested in sort of ways in which that framing can neglect the sort of accumulated wisdom of things like kind of like whatever's going on with things like liberalism and property rights, and kind of how do we like leave agents different like boundaries and a domain in which they can like act autonomously and we don't interfere. There's just like a bunch of stuff that I think a very naive ontology of kind of rational agents just like competing for resources doesn't necessarily capture. And I think there are questions about like what level of abstraction those considerations are relevant. But I have some sense that thinking about citizenship and kind of boundaries and a bunch of other things might be useful as we start to enter a world with kind of agents that are potentially much more different than the kind of other different agents we've been used to interacting with.
Yeah, no, that's true. That if we stay too much in our current like scarcity mindset, I guess that it doesn't really, help us in this situation, or it doesn't really get to the truth, I guess. Yeah, no, okay. Well, so is there anything you think we can do to prepare better for this crazy future that we may be heading towards?
I mean, I think a basic thing. I mean, to some extent, all of this work on existential risk and other things is about preparing for a potentially crazy future. I think one intervention that I'll flag here is, I think, just like interventions that aim to improve our epistemology and our wisdom more broadly, I think seem pretty robustly useful. There are questions about how can we be doing better forecasting and maybe AI assisted forecasting? How can we be using AIs to kind of help us discern the truth about things, or kind of reason well, or kind of understand our values well, deliberate well, kind of cooperate well? So there's kind of a host of kind of virtues in the vicinity of kind of reason and wisdom and kind of clarity and truth that I think seem pretty good and kind of important as we start to transition into kind of an especially unfamiliar environment, and that sort of new technologies might be able to help us with.
Yeah, thank you. I think a lot of those, like I said, there's a lot of transhumanists in the foresight community, and so I think, a lot of those technologies are kind of here already, I guess, or it's just, the future is here. It's just unevenly distributed. I think just I only have 1 minute left now, but I'll ask you the final the final question that we ask it always is like, what's the best advice you ever got?
I'm not sure if this counts as advice, but I remember, I think it was in like 2009 or 8 or something. I visited for the first time the San Francisco Zen Center, and my memory is that on the bell there is when I first saw this quote. It's a quote from Dogen, and it's sort of written on the bell that they hit, and it says something like, "Great is the matter of birth and death. Life is fleeting. Gone, gone. Awake, awake. Each one. Do not waste this life." And so anyway, I think that's words to live by.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Do not waste this life. Yeah, and very powerful if you add a gong to it, I guess. Yeah, thank you so much, Joe, for coming and sharing your thoughts on this. And we definitely have your article also on Utopia linked on the Existential Hope website. Thank you so much for coming.
No, thank you for having me.